There are towns in Canada where the clock's never quite caught up, where the diner on the main street has had the same menu since 1958, where the barber shop still has the same chair, the same prices painted on the window, and the same man cutting hair that's been doing it for 40 years, where kids still ride bikes in the street until the sun goes down, where nobody locks their front door. Some people call these places behind the times. I call them the last honest towns in Canada. Before we get into the list, I want to tell you what I mean when I say 1950s. I'm not talking about the politics. I'm not talking about everything that was wrong with that era, and there was plenty. I'm talking about a feeling. The feeling of a town that still believes in itself, where the hardware store is owned by the family whose name is on the sign, where the hockey arena is the center of the community and not a real estate development waiting to happen, where people still sit on their front porches. These are towns that modernization passed over, and rather than disappearing, they doubled down on who they were. Every single place on this list is real. Every single one still exists, and every single one you can visit. Let's start at number 10. Number 10. Hartney, Manitoba Hartney. Manitoba sits in the southwestern corner of the province, about 45 minutes from the North Dakota border. Population, just over 400 people. And yet it has a main street that most Canadian cities with populations 10 times larger would be jealous of. The grain elevator still dominates the skyline the way grain elevators used to dominate every prairie town before the consolidation years tore most of them down. In Hartney, they kept it, because Hartney keeps things. The hardware store has been in the same family for 3 generations. The owner will tell you the story of every item on the shelf if you give him enough time, and he will give you a good price because he knows your grandfather probably bought something here too. But what makes Hartney feel genuinely, authentically 1950s is not the buildings. It's the pace. People wave at cars they don't recognize, not because they're being polite, because a car they don't recognize means a visitor, and a visitor is interesting. The skating rink is the social center of the town from November through March. Not a leisure complex, not a multi-use facility, a hockey rink with wooden boards and cold air, and the smell of sharpened blades. Hartney has rejected pretty much entirely the idea that growth means transformation. Their population has barely changed in 60 years. They would tell you that's not a problem. That's the point. Number 9, Lunenburg, Nova Scotia. Lunenburg is on the UNESCO World Heritage List, which means it has technically been recognized by the entire world as a place worth preserving exactly as it is, and yet most Canadians have never been there. This is a town on Nova Scotia's south shore that was founded by German and Swiss settlers in 1753, and where the street plan, the building facades, and the waterfront have remained almost completely unchanged since the 19th century. But the 1950s feeling in Lunenburg is not about the architecture, it's about the fishing. Lunenburg is still a working fishing port, not a heritage replica of one, an actual operational fish on the dock, boats leaving before sunrise fishing community. The men who work those boats are the descendants of the men who built this town, and they do it the way it has always been done here, because the ocean doesn't care about modernization. Walk the main street at 7 in the morning and you will see something almost impossible to find in contemporary Canada, a town that is simply going about its business. No performance of small-town life for tourists, no Instagram installations, no co-working spaces and heritage buildings, fishermen heading to the dock, a bakery opening, a hardware store that sells actual hardware. Lunenburg has figured out something that urban planners have been trying to reverse engineer for 30 years. You cannot manufacture authenticity, you can only protect it. Number 8, Vulcan, Alberta. I'm aware that Vulcan, Alberta has become somewhat famous for leaning into its name's connection to a certain science fiction franchise. There is a spaceship replica on the main street. There is a tourism center themed around interstellar travel. But if you can look past that for a moment, and I promise it's worth it, Vulcan is one of the most genuinely intact small prairie towns in Western Canada. Founded in 1910, Vulcan was built on wheat. The town was designed around the railway, which meant the grain elevators came first, and the community grew around them. That order of priorities, grain, then people, then everything else, shaped the character of the town in ways that are still visible today. The Agricultural Society of Vulcan County has been running the same annual fair since 1912. Not a reboot, not a revival. The same fair, with the same categories for livestock judging and baking competitions, in the same sense that the land and the people who work it are still the most important thing happening here. The curling rink is packed every winter. The hockey parents are serious in the way that hockey parents in small Alberta towns have always been serious. The coffee shop opens at 6 because the farmers who come in need to be back in their fields by 8. The 1950s feeling in Vulcan is not nostalgic performance, it is agricultural reality. The rhythms of this town are still set by the land, the harvest, the weather, the price of grain. The same forces that set those rhythms in 1952 set them today. The spaceship is just the thing they put up so people would stop and look. Number 7, Flin Flon, Manitoba/Saskatchewan. Flin Flon sits on the border of Manitoba and Saskatchewan, partially in both provinces simultaneously, built on top of Canadian shield rock so hard that when the town was constructed they didn't level the land. They built the streets into the rock. There are staircases in Flin Flon that function as public streets, officially designated roads that are actually staircases carved into the Canadian shield. That tells you something about this place. Flin Flon was built around a copper and zinc mine that opened in 1927. For 60 years, the mine was the town. The Hudson Bay Mining and Smelting Company built the houses, ran the community center, sponsored the hockey team. The mine has slowed significantly, but the identity it created has not. There's a word for what Flin Flon feels like, and that word is gritty. Not in a romantic way, in the way that a town feels when the people who live there have genuinely worked hard for a long time and have the hands to prove it. The diner on Main Street serves the kind of breakfast that a man going underground for 8 hours actually needs, not the kind of breakfast that looks good on a lifestyle blog. The hockey history here is extraordinary. Flin Flon has produced more NHL players per capita than almost anywhere in Canada. Bobby Clarke grew up here. Theoren Fleury grew up here. The town takes that seriously in the way that only a town where hockey is genuinely survival level important can. People in Flin Flon will tell you the town has seen better days, and then they will invite you in for coffee, because that is what people did in the 1950s. And apparently that is still what people do in Flin Flon. Number 6, Tignish, Prince Edward Island. Tignish is at the very tip of Prince Edward Island, as far west and north as you can go on the island before you run out of land. Population, around 800 people. It has a church so large and architecturally ambitious that the first time you see it rising above the surrounding potato farms, you assume you must have misread the population sign. That church, St. Simon and St. Jude, was built in 1860 by the Acadian and Irish fishing and farming communities who settled this corner of the island. It seats over 900 people. In a town of 800, they built it that big on purpose, because they intended to fill it, and for a long time they did. Tignish also has something genuinely rare in modern Canada, a credit union that has been continuously operating since 1864. The Tignish Credit Union is one of the oldest cooperative financial institutions in North America. It was founded on a principle that has not changed in 160 years, people in a community pooling their resources to support each other, rather than sending their money south to a bank that has no particular interest in whether Tignish survives. The fishing is still central. The lobster season each spring is the economic and social heartbeat of the community. The whole town organizes around it. The kids know what time the boats come in. Tignish feels like the 1950s because it was built on the 1850s, and nothing that came after ever fully displaced what was already here. The land is still farmed. The sea is still fished. The church is still standing. And the credit union is still open on Main Street. Number 5, Rossland, British Columbia. Rossland, British Columbia, sits at nearly 1,000 meters elevation in the Monashee Mountains, close to the Washington state border. It was built on gold. In 1897, Rossland was the third largest city in British Columbia. 40,000 people, an opera house, electric streetcars, more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in Canada. Then the gold ran out. What happened next in most boom towns is abandonment, or transformation into something unrecognizable. In Rossland, something else happened. The people stayed, and they became a different kind of town. By the 1950s, Rossland had settled into a quieter identity built around the mountain, the community, and the specific kind of stubbornness that develops in people who choose to stay somewhere difficult when they could have left. The downtown core today looks almost exactly as it did in 1955, not because of heritage preservation funding, but because nobody tore it down. The buildings are still in use. The families who own them are often the same families who owned them 3 generations ago. The Rossland Miners Union Hall, built in 1898, still stands on the main street. It hosted dances in the 1920s, labor meetings in the 1930s, community events in the 1950s, community events today. The same building, the same purpose, different decades. There is a legion here that is genuinely the social center of the town, not a legacy institution barely holding on, a packed, loud, important place where the community actually gathers. In most of Canada, the Legion is something older generations speak about in the past tense. In Rossland, it is present tense, every Friday night. Number 4, Elora, Ontario Elora. Ontario sits at the edge of a gorge cut by the Grand River into the limestone bedrock of Wellington County. The gorge is spectacular in the way that Ontario geological features rarely get credit for being spectacular, but the gorge is not why Elora feels like the 1950s. Elora's main street is lined with buildings constructed almost entirely between 1832 and 1880. Limestone buildings built to last centuries, which they have. The streetscape is so intact that it has been used repeatedly as a film location for period productions set in mid-century small-town Canada. Because it looks exactly like mid-century small-town Canada. Because it still is mid-century small-town Canada. The Elora mill has been on this site since 1832. It has been a grist mill, a woolen mill, a flour mill, and is now an inn and restaurant. But the building is the original building. The stone is the original stone. The mill wheel is still there. What makes Elora different from a preserved heritage town is that it is still a living community. The people who live here are not curators. They are residents. The kids go to the same school their grandparents went to. The farmers who sell at the weekly market are farming the same land their families have farmed for 5 generations. In the 1950s, there were about 2,000 people in Elora. There are about the same number today. The population has barely moved in 70 years. And neither have the buildings or the feeling. We're in the top 3. And I want you to know, I've saved the 3 towns on this list that didn't just preserve the feeling of the 1950s by accident. These are places where the community made a conscious choice, or in some cases multiple conscious choices over multiple generations, to remain exactly who they are. That takes something. In a country that has spent 50 years being told that growth is good and change is progress, staying the same is actually an act of resistance. Number 3, Chemainus, British Columbia. In 1983, the sawmill that had kept Chemainus, British Columbia, alive for over a century announced it was closing. The town of 4,000 people on Vancouver Island faced the future that had already consumed dozens of other mill towns across the province. Depopulation, business closures, the slow deflation of a community that no longer has an economic reason to exist. The town council did something audacious. They hired muralists, not to decorate the town, not to make it pretty for tourists, to paint the town's own history on its walls, to make Chemainus itself the attraction, to say, in the most literal possible way, our story is worth seeing. The first 5 murals went up in 1982, the year before the mill closed. They depicted the original Coast Salish peoples who lived here, the arrival of European settlers, the early logging operations, the families who built the community. The tourists came, slowly at first, then steadily. The mill eventually reopened, smaller but operating. The town survived. Today there are over 40 murals in Chemainus, and they cover a century and a half of local history in a way that no museum exhibit could replicate, because they're not in a museum. They're on the buildings where the history happened. But what makes Chemainus feel like the 1950s is not the murals, it's what the murals protected. Because while the murals were drawing visitors in, the town was quietly holding on to what it already had. The independent hardware store, the family-run diner where the owner knows everyone's order, the Legion where the veterans, and now the veterans' grandchildren, still gather. The town did not reinvent itself for tourism. It used tourism to remain itself. There is a mural in Chemainus of a logging crew from 1895, young men with axes standing in front of a Douglas fir so large it takes 6 of them with their arms extended to encircle it. The grandson of one of those men still lives in Chemainus. His grandfather is on the wall. That is not something you can manufacture. Number 2, Havelock, Ontario. Havelock. Ontario is a small town in Peterborough County with a population of about 1,400 people. If you drive through it without stopping, it looks like dozens of other small Ontario towns that the 401 bypassed and the economy largely forgot. If you stop, you stay. Havelock was built around the railway. The Canadian Pacific Line came through in 1878, and the town grew up around the station. Lumber, grain, livestock. The railway moved it all, and Havelock was the junction point. When the railway reduced its presence in the mid-20th century, as it did in dozens of similar towns, Havelock did not dramatically pivot. It did not rebrand. It did not apply for heritage district status and open boutique hotels. It carried on. The CPR station, which should by rights have been demolished decades ago, was restored by the community in the 1990s, not with government money, with local fundraising, volunteer labor, and the kind of communal effort that urbanists write about enviously from cities where nobody knows their neighbors. The annual Havelock Country Jamboree has been running since 1978 and draws tens of thousands of people to this town of 1,400 for a long weekend every August. Country music, camping, community. This is a town that knows who it is. But the detail that captures Havelock for me, the thing that made me put it at number 2 on this list, is the hardware store. There is a hardware store on the main street of Havelock that has been in continuous operation since 1952. The current owner is the third generation of the same family. He stocks the same categories of goods his grandfather stocked: fasteners, plumbing supplies, paint, tools. He knows which local farmers use which brand of fence post. He knows which cottagers on the lake call in October, needing winterizing supplies. He knows the people who walk through his door the way that only a third-generation hardware store owner in a town of 1,400 can know people. In the 1950s, every town had a store like this. In most towns, it closed when Home Depot arrived 60 kilometers away. In Havelock, people chose not to let that happen. They kept shopping local, and the store is still there. Number 1, Baddeck, Nova Scotia. Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. He held over 18 patents. He conducted research on aviation, hydrofoil craft, and optical telecommunications. He was arguably the most innovative mind of the late 19th century. He could have lived anywhere in the world. He chose Baddeck, Nova Scotia. Bell first visited Baddeck on the Brador Lake in 1885 when he was 38 years old and already world famous. He spent the rest of his life returning. He built his estate here. He conducted much of his later research here. He died here in 1922 and was buried on the hill overlooking the lake that he loved. The question worth asking is, what did Alexander Graham Bell see in Baddeck? What could a man who had the resources and the reputation to live anywhere see in a small Cape Breton town? Spend an afternoon in Baddeck and the answer becomes clear. The Brador Lake is an inland sea. It connects to the Atlantic, is influenced by tides, and stretches over 1,000 square kilometers. It is enormous. And yet Baddeck sits at its edge with the quiet confidence of a town that knows it does not need to compete with the view. The main street is 4 blocks long. There is a bookstore that has been there since the 1970s and shows no signs of leaving. There is a restaurant where the fish came out of those waters this morning. There is a museum dedicated to Bell's work that is genuinely one of the finest small museums in Canada. But the thing that makes Baddeck feel like the 1950s is something harder to define. It is the pace, not slow in the way that a town without ambition is slow. Slow in the way that a town with complete confidence in itself is slow. Nobody in Baddeck is in a hurry because nobody in Baddeck has decided that hurrying is the point. There are sailboats on the lake on summer evenings. People sit on the dock and watch them. They don't film them. They don't post them. They just watch. Bell gave a speech near the end of his life about why he kept coming back to Baddeck. He said that there was no place in the world more beautiful, and that beauty, genuinely experienced, was the most productive environment he had ever worked in. A man who changed the world chose this quiet Cape Breton town as the place where he could think most clearly. I'm not sure the town has changed very much since Bell walked those streets. I think he would recognize it. I think that is exactly the point. Every town on this list made choices, not always conscious ones, not always dramatic ones. Sometimes the choice was just not to change, to let the next generation run the hardware store, to keep the rink open, to fix the church roof one more time. Small choices made year after year that add up to a community that still feels like a community. I've been to a lot of these places. And the thing I noticed every time is that people who live in towns like these don't think of themselves as preserving anything. They're just living the way their parents lived and their grandparents before them. And somehow that turns out to be the rarest thing in the country. Tell me in the comments, have you been to any of these towns? Or is there one I missed that deserves to be on this list? Because I know there are dozens more, and I'm already building the next one. If you found this video through someone sharing it, subscribe. Because next week I'm covering the Canadian towns that were so isolated, so completely cut off from the outside world, that they developed their own dialects, their own economies, and in some cases, their own laws. Those ones are even more extraordinary. I'll see you there.